She laughed. The kind of laugh that cuts deeper than any knife could, sharp, dismissive, laced with the cruel confidence of youth. "Dad, you're so broke it's embarrassing," Jessica declared, her 25-year-old face alight with amusement at his expense. "I can't believe you're still driving that ancient Toyota. It's literally older than me." Her perfectly manicured hand gestured toward the driveway where Martin's faithful 1998 Camry sat, its faded green paint telling stories of 2 decades of loyal service. Martin Jensen stood quietly in his modest living room, the evening sun casting long shadows across the worn but meticulously clean carpet. At 60, his face had become a map of time, each line earned through decades of early mornings, late nights, and the quiet worry that accompanies raising a child alone. His calloused hands, now fidgeting with the frayed edge of his flannel shirt, had built more than he could ever explain to his daughter. The girls at work were talking about their parents' vacation homes and investment properties, Jessica continued, scrolling through her phone, barely looking up at the man who had never missed a single one of her school events. "And then there's you, living in this place." Her eyes flicked dismissively around the small 3-bedroom house where she'd grown up, the house where Martin had taught her to ride a bike in the driveway, where he'd stayed up countless nights helping with homework, where he'd held her as she cried through her first heartbreak. The words landed like blows, each one striking with precision against the armor he'd built over decades of sacrifice. Martin felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the pressure of unshed tears behind his weathered eyes. Not because she thought him poor, he'd never cared much for appearances, but because she couldn't see the wealth that surrounded her. The wealth he'd prioritized above all else. "When was the last time you even bought yourself new clothes?" Jessica laughed again, pulling at the sleeve of his sweater, the one he'd owned since before her high school graduation. "This thing belongs in a museum, Dad. It's like you're allergic to spending money." Martin remembered buying that sweater. It was the week after he'd paid the final installment of Jessica's braces. The orthodontist had commented on how unusual it was for someone to pay in such consistent monthly amounts rather than financing through insurance. Martin had simply nodded, not explaining how he'd taken on weekend maintenance work at the apartment complex across town to ensure those payments never faltered. "And these shoes." Jessica was on a roll now, pointing to his sensible brown loafers, resoled twice but still perfectly functional. "I bet you've had them since the Stone Age. Don't you ever want nice things?" What Jessica couldn't see were the nights Martin had sat at the kitchen table, calculator in hand, meticulously balancing his checkbook to ensure her dance lessons could continue uninterrupted when his company announced layoff. She couldn't see the lunches he'd skipped, bringing leftovers in reused containers while his coworkers ordered delivery. She didn't know about the promotion he'd declined, because it would have meant traveling when she had important school events. "You know," Jessica sighed dramatically, dropping onto his sofa with the casual entitlement of someone who had never known true want, "Brian's dad just bought a vacation cabin in Aspen. And here you are, probably counting pennies for retirement. It's kind of sad, honestly." Brian's dad. Martin knew him casually. Dave Thornton, who worked in finance and drove a car that cost more than Martin made in a year. Dave, who had missed his son's high school graduation because of an unmissable business trip. Dave, who was now on his third wife and whose children primarily communicated with him through carefully worded text messages. Martin felt something shift inside him. Not anger. He could never feel truly angry at the daughter who remained his greatest joy, but a profound sadness that somehow, despite his best efforts, he had failed to teach her what really mattered. "What's the point of working so hard if you live like you're broke?" Jessica continued, her voice softer now but no less cutting. "Don't you want to enjoy life a little?" Enjoy life. Martin almost smiled at the irony. His greatest enjoyment had been watching Jessica grow, being present for every milestone, creating a home where she felt secure enough to dream. He'd found profound pleasure in the small things. Teaching her to bake her grandmother's cookie recipe, weekend trips to the local lake rather than expensive resorts, the quiet evenings reading together before bedtime. Seriously, Dad, Jessica said, glancing at her watch, the expensive one she'd bought herself with her first corporate paycheck, a fact she'd mentioned repeatedly. You should think about your image a little more. First impressions matter in this world. Martin thought about first impressions. He remembered the impression he'd made on Jessica's kindergarten teacher, who had commented that she'd never seen a child so well prepared for school. He thought about the impression he'd made on Jessica's college counselor, who had remarked on the extraordinary bond between father and daughter. He thought about the impression he'd made on his neighbors over 20 years, reliable, honest, the first to offer help when needed. I bet you don't even have enough saved for a decent retirement, Jessica said, her tone shifting to one of patronizing concern. You should let me help you figure out your finances. I've been doing really well at work, you know. Something in her dismissive tone, the absolute certainty that her father couldn't possibly have managed his money wisely, finally broke through Martin's patience. Without a word, he walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, opened the drawer, and removed a leather portfolio that Jessica had never seen before. What's that? Your budget written in stone tablets. Jessica laughed, but there was a hint of curiosity in her voice now. Martin sat beside his daughter, the woman he'd raised alone since she was 4 years old after her mother decided family life wasn't for her. He opened the portfolio silently and handed her a bank statement. What is this supposed to? Her voice trailed off as her eyes widened, scanning the document. The laughter died in her throat, replaced by a confused, "That can't be right." Martin handed her another statement. And another. And yet another. Jessica's face transformed as each paper passed through her hands, smugness giving way to confusion, then shock, then something like embarrassment. The final document, the deed to a small apartment building on the north side of town, left her completely speechless. I don't understand, she finally whispered, all traces of condescension evaporated. How did you? Martin looked at his daughter, seeing for the first time in years the little girl who used to look at him with unbridled admiration, before designer labels and social status became her measure of success. I've owned that apartment building for 15 years, he said quietly. Bought it when the housing market crashed. The rent from those 12 units alone brings in more each month than I ever made at my job. Jessica stared at him, her perfectly glossed lips parted in shock. The other properties are all paid off too, Martin continued, pointing to several other statements. That ancient Toyota out there? I could buy a new car any time I want, with cash. I choose not to. But you never. Jessica struggled to reconcile this new information with her perception of her penny-pinching father. Why would you live like this if you didn't have to? Martin looked around at his modest home, the home where every square inch held memories of raising his daughter. The wall where he'd marked her height every birthday. The kitchen where he'd taught her to cook. The backyard where she'd practice soccer until dark. Because I never wanted you to think that stuff matters, he said simply. I never wanted you to believe that what you own defines what you're worth. Jessica's eyes filled with tears as decades of misconceptions crumbled around her. All this time I thought. I know what you thought, Martin said gently. And that's my failure as a parent. Somehow, despite everything, I still manage to raise a daughter who believes wealth is something you display rather than something you build. The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken realizations. Outside, the sun had nearly set, casting the room in a golden glow that seemed to soften the edges of their confrontation. Those friends of yours, with their parents' vacation homes and luxury cars, Martin finally said. Do you know how many of them will inherit debt rather than wealth? Do you know how many of those parents are one missed paycheck away from losing it all? Jessica looked down at the papers in her lap, evidence of a financial reality she had never imagined. Why didn't you ever tell me? Martin reached out and took her hand. Because I wanted you to love me for being your dad, not for being wealthy. I wanted you to learn the value of work, of delayed gratification. I never wanted you to become someone who measures people by their bank accounts. Like I just did to you, Jessica whispered, shame coloring her cheeks. Like you just did to me, Martin echoed softly, no accusation in his voice, only a gentle sadness that pierced Jessica's heart more effectively than any rebuke could have. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of revelation. Jessica stared at the papers in her lap, her fingers tracing the numbers that shattered every assumption she'd made about her father's life. The evening had grown darker, shadows stretching across the worn carpet that she'd once dismissed as cheap, but now recognized as something far more valuable, durable, practical, chosen with care rather than impulse. I don't understand, she finally said, her voice small. If you have all this money, why would you choose to live this way? She gestured around the modest living room with walls that hadn't been repainted in at least a decade, at furniture that was comfortable but far from fashionable. Martin's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners as he considered his response. How could he explain a lifetime of values to someone who had somehow missed absorbing them despite his best efforts? Come with me, he said simply, rising from the sofa with a slight groan, the legacy of 40 years of physical labor that no amount of money could erase from his joints. Jessica followed her father through the familiar hallway, past the gallery of framed photographs that chronicled her life from infancy to college graduation. She'd always found it embarrassing how her father insisted on displaying every school portrait, every dance recital, every soccer tournament. Now, seeing his weathered face illuminated briefly as they passed beneath the hallway light, she wondered if she'd misunderstood everything about him. Martin led her to the small room at the end of the hall. His home office, a space Jessica had rarely entered even as a child. It had always seemed boring to her, with its filing cabinets and simple desk. No expensive gaming setup like her friends' parents had, no impressive technology. Just shelves of books and papers. He flipped on the light switch, illuminating the space that suddenly seemed different to Jessica's eyes. The desk wasn't just old-fashioned, it was an actual antique, its rich cherry wood glowing with the patina that only comes from decades of careful use. The chair behind it, worn at the armrests where her father's elbows had rested through countless evenings, was genuine leather of a quality she recognized from luxury stores. "Sit," Martin said, gesturing to the chair as he turned to one of the filing cabinets. Jessica lowered herself into her father's chair, surprised by its comfort. From this perspective, facing the desk rather than looking at it from the doorway, she noticed for the first time the photographs carefully positioned where he would see them while working, all of her, at different ages. Her father had spent his evenings surrounded by her face. Martin withdrew a thick folder from the filing cabinet and placed it on the desk before her. "Open it," he instructed gently. Inside was a collection of documents that told a story Jessica had never imagined. Insurance policies, education funds, investment records dating back to before she was born, and most surprisingly, charitable donation receipts, thousands of dollars given annually to causes ranging from the local food bank to international disaster relief. "I don't do it for recognition," Martin said, noticing her widened eyes as she registered the amounts. "I do it because I can, and because I should." "All these years," Jessica murmured, "I thought we lived this way because we had to. Because you couldn't afford better." Martin leaned against the desk, his work-hardened hands crossed over his chest. "We live this way because we chose to. Because there's a difference between what you want and what you need." He paused, gathering thoughts he'd never articulated aloud. "When your mother left, you were only 4. I made 2 promises to myself then, that you would never lack for anything essential, and that you would grow up understanding the difference between value and cost." Jessica flinched at the mention of her mother, a glamorous, restless woman who had decided that family life was too constraining for her ambitions. Over the years, birthday cards had arrived sporadically, along with occasional expensive gifts that always seemed chosen for their price tags rather than personal meaning. The contrast between her parents had never been so stark as in this moment. The first promise was easy to keep, Martin continued. The second. He gestured to Jessica, a sad smile playing at his lips. Well, I'm not sure I succeeded there. The gentle rebuke landed like a physical blow. Jessica thought about her designer purse sitting on her father's worn sofa, about the luxury car she'd leased to impress colleagues, about the credit card debt she was quietly accumulating to maintain the lifestyle she thought necessary. Your grandfather taught me something valuable, Martin said, pulling out the chair opposite Jessica and lowering himself into it. He said wealth should be silent. That truly wealthy people rarely feel the need to prove it to anyone. Grandpa Jensen? But he was. Jessica stopped herself before saying poor, suddenly uncertain about everything she thought she knew. A millionaire by the time he was 50, Martin finished for her. He grew up during the Depression, knew the value of every dollar because he'd seen what happens when they disappear overnight. Jessica's mind reeled as another piece of family mythology crumbled. She'd always thought of her grandfather as frugal to the point of eccentricity, with his darned socks and insistence on growing his own vegetables. She'd never connected his habits to the secure retirement he and her grandmother had enjoyed, traveling the country in their modest RV, helping family members when needed, never seeming worried about money. This is the inheritance he left me, Martin continued, opening a desk drawer and withdrawing a small, worn leather book. Not just money, though there was some of that too. This was worth more. He handed the book to Jessica. Opening it, she found page after page of careful accounting in her grandfather's precise handwriting. Income noted, expenses categorized, investments tracked. Simple principles written on the inside cover. Live below your means. Save for tomorrow. Give generously. Find joy in what cannot be bought. I started keeping my own version the day you were born, Martin said, pulling out another book, this one in his familiar handwriting. Every expense, every investment, every decision made with your future in mind. Jessica flipped through the pages, seeing entries that corresponded with milestones in her life. Dance lessons, braces, college tuition. But she also saw evidence of her father's hidden life. Property acquisitions, stock purchases, retirement account contributions that seemed impossibly large compared to what she'd believed was his modest salary. You could have had anything, she whispered, a new understanding dawning. You chose this life. I had everything that mattered, Martin corrected gently. A home, good health, meaningful work, the privilege of raising you. He reached across the desk, his calloused finger tapping the open page of his financial journal. These are just numbers. They don't define wealth. Jessica's eyes blurred with tears as years of misplaced pity for her father transformed into something else, a dawning respect for choices she'd completely misunderstood. Do you remember Mrs. Abernathy next door? Martin asked suddenly. Jessica nodded. The elderly widow had lived beside them throughout her childhood, her small home always immaculate, her garden a neighborhood showcase. She was dying of cancer when you were in high school, Martin continued. Worried sick about medical bills eating away the legacy she hoped to leave her grandchildren. I remember you used to help with her yard work, Jessica said, the memory surfacing. You'd mow her lawn when you did ours. Martin smiled. I did more than that. I paid off her mortgage. Jessica's mouth fell open. You what? Anonymously, through the bank. She never knew. But she spent her final months at peace, knowing her house would pass unencumbered to her daughter. Martin's eyes took on a distant look. That's the kind of wealth that matters, Jess. Not what you can buy, but what you can do for others when the opportunity arises. Why didn't you ever tell me these things? Jessica asked, her voice thick with emotion. Would you have understood? Martin countered gently. Or would you have seen it as an opportunity to upgrade our lifestyle, to spend rather than save, to show rather than grow? The question hung in the air between them, uncomfortably accurate. Jessica thought about how often she'd complained about their modest vacations, their reliable but unfashionable car, their embarrassing home in a neighborhood that wasn't prestigious enough for her taste. She'd interpreted her father's careful stewardship as either inability or stinginess, never considering it might be intentional, principled, wise. "I wanted you to learn the satisfaction of earning," Martin continued. "The security that comes from spending less than you make. The freedom of owing nothing to anyone." He sighed. "But somewhere along the way you started measuring success by different standards." "My friends," Jessica began, then stopped, suddenly hearing how childish the excuse sounded. "Your friends," Martin nodded, "who post their highlight reels on social media, who finance luxury lifestyles they can't afford, who work jobs they hate to pay for things they don't need to impress people they don't even like." Jessica flinched at the accuracy of the assessment. She thought of her coworker Brian, always showing off new purchases while quietly complaining about the crushing weight of his student loans. Of Sophia, who had the perfect Instagram life and a maxed-out credit card collection to maintain it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate for the magnitude of her misunderstanding. "I judged you by the wrong measures. I thought you were." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Broke," Martin supplied, no judgment in his tone. "You thought I was broke because I didn't display the traditional symbols of success, because I valued security over status, because I chose to build wealth rather than appear wealthy. And all this time you were exactly who I've always been," Martin finished. "A man who has enough, who knows what enough means, who finds joy in simplicity and peace in financial security." Jessica looked around the office with new eyes, seeing not outdated furnishings but conscious choices. Not deprivation but intention. Not failure but a different, quieter kind of success. The kind that didn't need to announce itself with logos and labels. "I have so much to learn from you," she admitted, closing the financial journal and running her fingers over its worn cover. Martin smiled, a genuine warmth replacing the hurt that had shadowed his features earlier. "That's all I've ever wanted to hear." The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge spanning the chasm of misunderstanding that had grown over years. Jessica's fingers still traced the worn leather of her father's financial journal, each page a testament to priorities she had failed to recognize, much less appreciate. "I should probably show you the rest," Martin said after a moment, rising from his chair with a slight wince. The legacy of decades of physical work that had quietly built an empire while she'd been dismissing him as outdated and unsuccessful. "There's more?" Jessica asked, her voice small. The revelations of the evening had already upended everything she thought she knew about her father, about wealth, about success itself. Martin nodded, extending his weathered hand. "Come on. We need to take a drive." The night air was crisp as they stepped outside, autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet as they walked toward Martin's infamous Toyota, the car Jessica had mocked just hours earlier. She slid into the passenger seat with a new awareness, noticing for the first time how immaculately maintained the interior was. Not new or luxurious, but clean, functional, cared for with attention that spoke of respect rather than resignation. They drove in silence through familiar neighborhoods that gradually gave way to the more commercial district of their small city. Jessica had expected they might visit one of the rental properties from the documents she'd seen, but instead, Martin turned down a street lined with small businesses, the heart of their community's local economy. He pulled into a parking space in front of a building Jessica had passed countless times without ever really noticing. A modest two-story brick structure with large windows displaying a warmly lit interior. The sign above read Community First Credit Union. "What are we doing here?" Jessica asked as Martin killed the engine. "Meeting someone," he replied simply, checking his watch. "He's waiting for us." Inside, the credit union's lobby was empty of customers this late in the evening, but a middle-aged man in a crisp button-down shirt stood when they entered, his face breaking into a wide smile at the sight of Martin. "Jensen. Right on time as always," the man said, stepping forward to shake Martin's hand with evident respect. "Thanks for staying late, David," Martin replied warmly. "This is my daughter, Jessica." "The famous Jessica," David beamed, extending his hand to her. "Your father talks about you constantly. Congratulations on the promotion at work. He was bursting with pride when he told us about it." Jessica blinked in surprise, both at being recognized and at the realization that her father had been sharing her accomplishments with others. She'd mentioned the promotion in passing weeks ago, assuming he hadn't fully grasped its significance in her competitive corporate environment. "Thank you," she managed, shaking his hand automatically. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand why we're here." David glanced at Martin with a questioning look. "Jessica's getting the full tour tonight," Martin explained. "She's ready to see behind the curtain." Understanding dawned on David's face. "Ah. Well then, let's start in the conference room. The board meeting just wrapped up, but I think most of them are still around having coffee." "Board meeting?" Jessica followed the two men down a hallway, her confusion growing with every step. They entered a modest conference room where several people sat chatting around a table littered with coffee cups and papers. Every head turned when they entered, and to Jessica's astonishment, each face lit up at the sight of her father. "Martin, we thought you'd ducked out early," said an elegant older woman, rising from her chair. "Not tonight, Eleanor," Martin replied. "I'd like you all to meet my daughter, Jessica." What followed was a blur of introductions: a retired school principal, two small business owners, a doctor, an accountant, all greeting her with genuine warmth and references to things her father had apparently told them about her over the years. Jessica shook hands automatically, struggling to process what was happening. "Jessica," David said once the introductions were complete, "welcome to the board of directors of Community First Credit Union. Your father has been our chairman for the past 11 years. She turned to Martin, speechless. Chairman? Her father, who she'd assumed spent his evenings watching old westerns on his outdated television, had been leading a financial institution? "We should probably explain," Martin said, noting her confusion. "David, would you mind?" David nodded eagerly. Community First was struggling back in 2014. The big banks were pushing us out, and we were losing members. Your father stepped in with a significant capital investment and a vision for how a community-based financial institution could thrive by serving people the big banks ignored. He gestured around the room. Everyone here believed in that vision, but Martin was the one who made it financially possible. "We provide fair loans to small businesses that would get overlooked by corporate banks," added Eleanor. "Help families buy their first homes. Offer financial literacy programs in the high schools. Your father established our emergency loan program," said the retired principal, his voice warm with admiration. "Interest-free loans for families facing medical emergencies or job loss. It's helped hundreds of local families avoid predatory lenders during difficult times." Jessica turned to look at her father, this quiet man who drove an old car and lived in a modest home, who wore the same watch for 20 years and darned his socks instead of replacing them. The man she had pitied and, yes, sometimes felt embarrassed by. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked, the question barely audible. Martin's expression was gentle. "Would it have mattered? Would a title have made you see me differently?" The honest answer lodged in her throat, painful in its truth. Yes, it would have. A title, a position of authority, these external validations would have given her something to boast about to friends. Something that fit her narrow definition of success. "We should continue the tour," Martin said quietly, thanking the board members and leading Jessica back out to the car. They drove again, this time to the north side of town, pulling up in front of the small apartment building Jessica had seen documented among her father's papers. It wasn't luxurious or particularly impressive, just a well-maintained 3-story building with neat landscaping and clean walkways. 12 units, Martin explained as they sat in the car. Rent is about 30% below market rate. Below market? Jessica questioned. Why would you charge less than you could get? Martin turned to her, his eyes reflective in the dim light. Because not everything is about maximizing profit, Jess. The families here. They're hard-working people who need stable housing they can afford. Single parents, elderly folks on fixed incomes, young couples saving for their first home. He pointed to a ground-floor window where a woman was visible helping a young child with what appeared to be homework. That's Maria. Works 2 jobs as a healthcare aide. She's raising her grandson because her daughter is struggling with addiction. Been here 4 years now. He nodded toward another unit. The Wilsons up there just celebrated their 50th anniversary. Fixed income from Social Security. They bake cookies for everyone in the building on holidays. Jessica listened as her father continued around the building, naming each tenant, knowing details of their lives, their challenges, their dreams. This wasn't just an investment property to him. These were people he knew, whose lives were more stable because of his choices. I could raise the rent to market rate tomorrow, Martin said finally. It would increase my return by thousands each month. But Maria would have to choose between rent and her grandson's asthma medication. The Wilsons would have to leave the neighborhood they've lived in for 30 years. So instead you, what? Subsidize their housing? Jessica asked, struggling to reconcile this philosophy with everything she'd learned in business school about maximizing returns. I provide fair housing at a rate that still gives me a reasonable return, Martin corrected. Just not an excessive one. Not one that comes at the cost of others' well-being. They drove again, this time to a small strip mall that Jessica recognized. It housed a locally owned grocery store, a barbershop, a family restaurant, and several other small businesses that had been fixtures in the community for as long as she could remember. I bought this property when the previous owner was planning to triple the rents to push these businesses out and bring in national chains, Martin explained, parking in the nearly empty lot. The bank thought I was crazy. Said I could make 3 times the return with corporate tenants. Jessica stared at the familiar storefronts, places she'd visited throughout her childhood without ever knowing her father's connection to them. Why keep them instead? Because Mr. Abadi at the grocery store has been extending credit to elderly customers on fixed incomes for 30 years, letting them pay when their Social Security checks arrive, Martin said. Because Tony at the barbershop gives free haircuts at the homeless shelter every month. Because the Garcias at the restaurant hire teenagers from the group home and teach them skills no one else would give them a chance to learn. Martin turned in his seat to face his daughter fully. These businesses are the backbone of our community, Jess. They employ local people, serve local needs, keep money circulating in our own economy rather than being extracted to corporate headquarters. Their value can't be measured just in dollars. Jessica sat in silence, absorbing the implications of what she was seeing and hearing. Her father wasn't just financially successful, he was purposeful, intentional. His wealth wasn't just accumulated, it was directed toward a vision of community that she had never fully appreciated or understood. There's one more place I want to show you, Martin said, starting the engine again. Their final stop was unexpected, the local community college campus. At this hour, the buildings were mostly dark, but lights still burned in one modern structure at the center of campus. The Jensen Technical Training Center, Martin explained, nodding toward the building. Named after your grandfather, officially. Though I provided the funding. Jessica stared at the building, then back at her father. You donated enough to get naming rights? How much? $5 million, Martin said quietly. Plus an endowment for scholarships for students who want to learn skilled trades but can't afford the training. The amount was staggering. Jessica tried to process the contradiction between the father who carefully watched electricity usage at home, who bought store-brand groceries and repaired things instead of replacing them, and the man who could casually donate millions to education. Why trades? She asked finally, focusing on the detail rather than the amount. Martin smiled slightly. Because not everyone is meant for a 4-year degree, but everyone deserves a path to meaningful work that pays well. Electricians, plumbers, welders, mechanics, these skills built this country, and they're increasingly rare and valuable. He nodded toward the building again. 300 students a year learn trades there that will earn them good livings without crushing student debt. Many of them are the first in their families to receive post-secondary education. Some are retraining after job losses. Others are immigrants building new lives. Jessica thought about her own education, the prestigious business school that had cost a fortune, where success was measured by how quickly graduates secured 6-figure corporate jobs, where the focus had been on personal advancement rather than community contribution. "You helped me pay for business school," she said slowly. "But you never pushed me toward it. You always said to find work that made me happy, that helped others in some way." "And has it?" Martin asked quietly. "Made you happy? Helped others?" The question landed with unexpected weight. Jessica thought about her corporate job with its competitive politics and focus on quarterly profit. The pressure to project success through possessions and experiences that looked good on social media but left her constantly striving for the next thing, the next promotion, the next status symbol. "I don't know," she admitted, the truth of it suddenly painful. "I'm good at it. It pays well. It impresses people when I tell them where I work and what I do. But that's not the same as finding it meaningful," Martin finished gently. They sat in silence, the illuminated building before them a testament to a different kind of success than the one Jessica had been pursuing, one measured in lives improved rather than appearances maintained, in community strengthened rather than status achieved. "I've been so blind," Jessica whispered finally, tears welling in her eyes. "So judgmental. So wrong about everything that matters." Martin reached across the center console to take his daughter's hand, his palm calloused from a lifetime of work that had accomplished so much more than she had ever recognized. "You haven't been wrong," he corrected softly. "You've just been looking through a particular lens, one that our culture reinforces at every turn. Consumption as success, appearance as reality, status as worth." He squeezed her hand gently. "But there are other ways to see the world, Jess. Other measures of a life well lived." Jessica looked at her father, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. The lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and worry. The silver threading through his hair that she had once urged him to color to look more professional. The unfashionable but warm jacket he wore not because he couldn't afford better, but because it served its purpose without waste or ostentation. In the dim light of the car, with the building bearing his family name visible through the windshield, Martin Jensen didn't look broke or pitiful or behind the times. He looked content, purposeful, at peace with choices made according to values she was only now beginning to understand. "I want to learn," Jessica said finally, her voice stronger now. "I want to understand how you see the world. How you've built all this while staying so—" She searched for the right word, grounded. Martin smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes and momentarily erased the hurt her earlier mockery had caused. "That's the best thing you could have said." He glanced at his watch, not an expensive status symbol but a reliable timekeeper that had served him for decades. "It's getting late. Let's head home. We have time for all of this." As they drove back through the quiet streets of the town where Jessica had grown up, she saw it with new eyes. Not as the provincial place she'd been eager to escape, but as a community, one her father had quietly helped strengthen and sustain through decades of intentional investment, both financial and personal. "Dad," she said as they pulled into the driveway of the home she'd dismissed as embarrassingly modest. "I'm sorry. Not just for tonight, but for years of not seeing you clearly. For judging you by standards that I'm not even sure I believe in anymore." Martin turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the darkness. "When you were little," he said finally, "you used to tell everyone your dad was the richest man in town." He chuckled softly at the memory. I'd get these looks from other parents who knew what I did for a living, knew where we lived. They thought you were confused or exaggerating. And was I? Jessica asked. Martin turned to her, his expression gentle but serious. That depends entirely on how you measure wealth, doesn't it?